Climate change, global pandemics, hunger and malnutrition. As humankind continues on our journey of rapid development, these are all crises weighing heavy on the world. But we are constantly innovating and developing the tools necessary to combat them. The field of genomics is one such tool. From improving the food we eat to transforming how cancers are treated and empowering us to protect the environment, genomics holds much promise in the fight against these challenges. However, while genomics offers enormous promise, it is hampered by the underrepresentation of equity-deserving groups and Indigenous peoples in the research landscape, in data sets, and governance and leadership bodies. This is leading to inequitable access to research resources, inequitable distribution of benefits, and ongoing exclusion. Despite these challenges, Indigenous leaders and their collaborators throughout Canada are spearheading genomics research initiatives focused on outcomes with high impact for Indigenous Canadians and communities, and which also have important implications for non-Indigenous populations and Canada's future economy. In partnership with Genome Canada, TheFutureEconomy.ca produced a spotlight feature on the future of Indigenous genomics innovation. We spoke with 3 leading voices in the field of Canadian genomics to highlight homegrown inclusive genomics projects that are working with communities and leveraging Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing to address grand challenges in health, food security, and climate mitigation. We explored how these initiatives will improve health, food, and environmental outcomes for Indigenous communities, what the importance of having Indigenous individuals, knowledge, and experience shaping that work is, and the experts' calls to action on what Canada must do now to ensure the success of Indigenous innovators in the future of Canadian genomics research. The study and application of genomics in the life sciences has had an incredible impact on health indicators and life expectancy. However, Indigenous populations tend to experience worse health outcomes and have worse healthcare experiences than non-Indigenous Canadians. Research shows that Indigenous populations consistently have a lower life expectancy than non-Indigenous people in Canada and elsewhere. This points to the exclusion of Indigenous people from healthcare, not just in terms of their access to healthcare itself, but also the lack of representation in health research projects and the questions they seek to answer. Dr. Nadine Caron, co-director for the University of British Columbia's Centre for Excellence in Indigenous Health, has seen firsthand how a lack of representation in research affects the quality and equity of innovation.
I think that access to research is a determinant of health, because if you're not at the table, if research is being done without you, if you're not part of the research questions and your communities, your peoples aren't there and benefiting from this, then in essence, there will be increased disparities in understanding of health conditions, and therefore increased disparities in access to treatments that work and the long-term impact.
The Silent Genomes project, of which Dr. Caron is co-lead, is focused on increasing genomics' impact on precision healthcare by addressing inequities in access to genomics research for Indigenous peoples in Canada.
So, silent genomes refers to the silent voices, the absence of representation, the paucity of choice for Indigenous peoples in Canada and really globally to be part of this precision medicine and to benefit from the incredible investment in both time, resources, and money in this space.
According to Dr. Caron, there are no known libraries of Indigenous DNA in existence today. Such DNA libraries are crucial for medical geneticists to diagnose all kinds of diseases, especially rare ones, with precision and efficiency. The Silent Genomes project will build such a library or biobank of genetic data for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in order to fill this gap.
I'm really excited as an Indigenous surgeon that when I have individuals that are refer to me and have a diagnosis such as cancer, that ultimately, with more time, more investment, and more research in this field for Indigenous genomics, that some of those questions that my patients have and their family has and their community has, specific to why their communities seem to have more of one cancer or why their family seem to have clusters of cancers, that I will no longer have to really rely on only access to research done only on non-Indigenous populations or research done with no Indigenous identifiers.
Innovations like a biobank of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis DNA are why many experts believe genomics will play a significant role in eliminating health disparities for Indigenous communities. Having Indigenous leaders like Dr. Caron at the forefront of health genomics research done by Indigenous researchers for their communities ensures that the future of health and access to it is more equitable for all Canadians. To ensure a truly healthy population, we must reduce hunger and malnutrition, and not just have enough food for all, but have enough good food for all. The UN projects that the global population may hit the 10 billion mark in the 2050s. More than 50% of this projected increase will be concentrated in low-income countries, making the global hunger and malnutrition crisis a challenge we must urgently address. Food security and safety are not only a challenge for the developing world. In Canada, nearly 15% of us experienced food security in 2021. That's 5.8 million Canadians, of which 1.4 million are children. And food insecurity is not just about missing meals. Approximately 12% of food insecure individuals in Canada have to resort to compromising on food quality to get by. That means poor nutrition, which can affect mental, emotional, physical, and psychological development. Dr. Tiffany Kenny, professor in Laval University's Department of Social and Preventative Medicine, says genomics can offer a solution. Tiffany leads the GELS component of ULaval's FISHES project. GELS, or GE3LS, stands for Genomics and its ethical, environmental, economic, legal, and social aspects. The project aims to integrate genomics and fisheries science with Indigenous knowledge to address critical socio-economic challenges and opportunities related to food security and commercial, recreational, and subsistence fisheries. Here's Tiffany on how selective breeding and genome modification can make food products that offer higher nutritional value, are more sustainable, and can be produced faster.
Global demand for seafood has more than doubled since the 1980s, and this has placed unprecedented pressures on wild fish populations that are facing challenges from climate change, from unsustainable harvests, from multiple anthropogenic factors. And one innovation that has helped to alleviate some of the pressure on wild fish catch has been aquaculture. There has been really interesting innovations in genomics in terms of, increasing growth rate, breeding for disease and parasite resistance, for features or traits that please consumers. So it could be higher levels of nutrients or colors or the quality of the fillets.
But Tiffany stresses that without Indigenous knowledge, these solutions may create future problems. Aquaculture can have a negative impact on biodiversity. Incidents of escaped farm fish can threaten local wild harvested fish, which many Indigenous communities rely on. Biodiversity has always been vitally important to Indigenous people, their communities, and food chains, and the numbers confirm that Indigenous knowledge and stewardship has a proven record of success in preserving biodiversity around the world.
Global biodiversity is declining at an unprecedented rate, and I think it's approximately 1 million species are currently at risk of extinction. But it's really interesting because biodiversity is declining at a significantly slower rate on lands that are governed by Indigenous peoples.
Studies have shown how Indigenous people, who make up only 5% of the global population, and despite the marginalization they face, protect about 80% of all biodiversity. It's therefore clear that Indigenous knowledge and experience is of the utmost value for understanding how to maintain biodiverse ecosystems and the food chains they support. In the case of aquaculture and fisheries management, Indigenous knowledge can help genomics projects develop solutions that are practical and sustainable for the long term.
I think, a really important area of application is within the co-management process. And so fisheries management in Indigenous land claim areas, for example, are governed through complex frameworks that involve Indigenous and scientific knowledge, and understanding how, advances in genomic technologies can be used to inform, to bring the best science to the table in these contexts is very complex, but it's also very important. And one of the important kind of goals that we're tasked with is to ensure that Indigenous knowledge is integrated in the project at all phases. At every one of those stages, there's a really important opportunity and there is a need to integrate Indigenous knowledge in terms of, which questions are posed, how the information is used, how Indigenous knowledge is shared, is collected, is stored. This is really important.
As the field continues to develop, it is crucial that genomics researchers integrate Indigenous knowledge into their investigations on innovative solutions aimed at improving ecosystem stability, food quality, and security. Indigenous and scientific knowledge must advance in tandem. Doing so will play a key role in improving food security and quality for Indigenous communities across Canada and the world. In Canada's Arctic, the water is ever-changing due to climate change. A 2022 report found that the Arctic is warming at 4 times the rate as the rest of the world. And Arctic sea ice, which is critical infrastructure for daily life in many northern communities, is fast disappearing. Researchers predict that the Arctic summer sea ice could disappear entirely by 2035, and genomics will be a key tool in assessing the impacts these changes are having, which are especially dramatic in Canada's Arctic.
There are a lot of opportunities for genomics research in the Arctic. The Arctic is changing at twice the rate of the rest of the planet, and the Canadian Arctic at almost 3 times the rate of the rest of the planet. It is in so many ways really kind of a ground zero in terms of the impacts of climate change.
That was Eric Solomon, the co-lead for Ikarvik, an Arctic youth-led initiative to help northern communities build relationships with southern researchers. The project aims to give Inuit people a stronger voice in the research and decisions that affect them, including in the field of genomics. He points to genomics research as being key to assessing the impacts of climate change on northern environments and animal populations that are crucial to Indigenous ways of life. For example, ongoing genomic studies of caribou populations is one such solution, as genomic monitoring that identifies mixing between populations can indicate how climate factors are pushing different groups together. In these cases, it is genomics precision that makes the difference. Many key environmental markers that show how our climate is changing cannot simply be observed with the naked eye.
Another really important role for genomics that I've seen in the Canadian Arctic has to do with environmental DNA. And that is basically, understanding that everything that is swimming or crawling in the ocean is shedding its DNA all the time, little bits. And we can't see it, but when we take samples of seawater and process them properly, we can actually see all of that DNA that's been floating around in the water. And identifying that means the ability to identify what's been swimming and what's been crawling in the water.
This is crucial to assessing the health of Arctic marine food chains and finding solutions that maintain and improve their health. And Indigenous people want to be part of the solution. In fact, when it comes to the Arctic, Eric argues that researchers must rely on the expertise of local Indigenous populations, especially the youth.
Youth in the communities are a really great bridge. They are able to connect researchers and communities, Western science and local Indigenous knowledge in ways that almost nobody else can, because they have this understanding, this comfort in an ability to sort of navigate within not just their own local Indigenous culture and ways of knowing, worldviews, but also the kind of Western science-based Southern ways of knowing and worldviews that someone like I carry around.
By involving Indigenous communities, especially Indigenous youth, in climate-related genomics research, researchers can better frame the questions they are asking and set their projects' priorities and goals to suit the concerns and needs of Indigenous communities. And it is now more important than ever to get those priorities right. The Arctic is the Canadian region most vulnerable to climate change, and what affects the Arctic will affect us all. We asked our 3 experts for their calls to action on what must be done now, and by who, to ensure the promise of genomics research is realized for all Canadians, especially Indigenous populations. Tiffany Kenny, professor in the Faculty of Medicine at Laval University, says the key for researchers, industry, and other stakeholders is in respecting Indigenous knowledge and the processes that have been put in place to protect Indigenous peoples.
The one thing that I would say, especially as it relates to genetics and genomics work, Indigenous people have really, really detailed knowledge that might be of interest to industry. Indigenous communities, territories and regions have made really important advances and have incredible leadership increasingly over research that's done in their territories. There's a lot there now that Indigenous communities have taken back in terms of how the research is governed. And it's really important to, I think, invest oneself in that process, recognizing that it takes time to genuinely arrive at a collaborative space. Like any formalized process, you can tick all the boxes, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you get to a process of co-creation or meaningful Indigenous involvement.
But it is not enough to just have the right intentions and frameworks in place. Research requires funding. And Eric Solomon, the co-lead for eCarvix, says that the government must re-examine the way it funds genomics research projects to be more inclusive of Indigenous initiatives.
There are a lot of ways that research outcomes can be improved, especially regarding genomics as it relates to Indigenous communities in the Arctic. Governments are one of the primary funders of genomics research, and the system that is set up for funding research is great for Southern-based researchers, but doesn't necessarily work for the needs of communities, how they need to be engaged and involved. So one of the important things I believe that needs to happen is government funding agencies need to begin to work directly with Indigenous communities and organizations to understand what they need out of this process so that it can work for them.
With the right funding systems in place, we then need to look at building up Indigenous genomics talent. Dr. Caron says academia has a big role to play in making this happen.
A specific call to action for post-secondary institutions in Canada is to take responsibility. When a child has a dream to go to university, you should be a culturally safe, welcoming, and supportive institution to open your doors for them. And when they walk through your doors, you should do everything you can to make sure that opportunities are there for them, support is there for them, and that they want to be part of this learning experience. If they choose to be researchers, great. If they don't choose to be researchers, that's fine. Because if you're providing the opportunity, Indigenous students will walk through those doors, and ultimately, Indigenous peoples in Canada will benefit from the research that's being done.
The power and promise of genomics to provide innovative solutions for our future challenges are immense. Genomics can help us build food systems that are climate resilient, economically viable, and environmentally sustainable. It can help us monitor and quickly respond to our changing climate. It is also vital to our ability to diagnose and treat diseases with more precision and better outcomes. But we can only unlock the full potential of genomics if we involve Indigenous knowledge in the conversation and the design of genomics projects that are focused on tackling Indigenous communities' challenges. Indigenous genomics leaders and their research partners are already charging ahead with these world-changing innovations. Their contributions and traditional knowledge cannot be denied or ignored. Doing so risks losing out on generations of wisdom and insight. It is now up to our governments, research community, and industries to provide Indigenous communities with the resources they need to participate in these conversations and lead Indigenous genomics research to create a better world for us all.